Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and wherever you're listening. I'm Jeremiah Rich, and this is the American Reckoning podcast, where speaks, faith leads, and light and truth endure. Thank you for joining me, not just for this episode, but hopefully for a journey. And personally, I could say it's been a humbling journey from the start. Did a couple of trial runs recording last week. Like I was trying to channel Paul Harvey or something with his storytelling method. And I quickly realized that my Texas accent doesn't work well with that format. A Paul Harvey, I'm not. So I'm going to give it to you straight from the hip and the story and story tell the way I know how. As if you're one of my former students sitting in my history class, or we're sitting at the bar or on the back porch discussing the events of the day. There'll likely be occasions that I get off track and go chasing some rabbits, so bear with me. Or take a deep dive into faith, history, and politics of our day. I want you to know who I am and why this program exists, because this isn't just commentary, this is a calling. My interest in history and politics didn't begin in college. I've been nearly a lifelong student of the subjects for quite a while. I think it began about the time I was 10 years old. I was that kid, the one who asked why about everything. Why is this happening? Why did this war start? Why is the government doing this? Why is the news saying that? As a kid, my family and I would take weekend trips once a month to go visit family around Texas, and during the summers, go see family in New Mexico and Arizona. For anybody that's lived or visited Texas, it usually takes 3 to 4 hours minimum in Texas, and even longer, depending on where you start, where you're going, and if you're trying to leave the state. My mom and dad would put me in the front seat when one or the other parent wasn't riding with us, not because I was a favorite, but because I talked nonstop. That hasn't changed. They figured, with me being in the front seat, I'd keep them awake on those long drives, and I did nonstop, ask questions why the whole time. And my parents didn't shut them down. They listened and they fed that curiosity I had about the world. What kind of made my childhood a bit different than many of the folks I grew up with in Texas is my family and I lived in Germany for a few years when my dad was stationed there, and it's where I began grade school. So early on, even after moving back to Texas, I had some sense and recognition that not all the world was the same. I am a Gen Xer, and for those of us growing up at the time, we kind of knew, and some of us had a realization, we were growing up in a very unique hinge point in history. Unlike our grandparents, we as children of the 70s, 80s, and 90s were seeing the world change live and in real time and beyond our little nook. Some of us were old enough. We witnessed the spaceship Challenger blow up on live TV, as many of us watched in our classrooms. Many of us saw from our TV screens the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. We watched the final collapse of the Soviet Union unfold over a few months in 1991. Some of us watched the Persian Gulf War unfold live and in real time on CNN, Fox News, ABC, CBS, and other news stations in our own classroom. That was something new at the time. This might not sound like it's a big deal now for today's younger generation, where you've always had the ability to watch everything now in real time, from news, sports, something, someone streaming something live on any app, on the comfort of your phone or laptop or tablet or TV screen. World-changing events wasn't something we were reading about in a textbook decades later, or watching a film from a battlefront a week or months later, like our parents and grandparents did during Vietnam, Korea, World War II. It was happening now and on screen. And I remember my dad and my granddad's reaction when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. See, both My dad and my grandpa were Cold War military vets. Our parents and grandparents at the time had lived underneath the shadow and tension of the Cold War most, if not all, their lives. They often wondered, or had in the back of their minds, if the world was going to end by a nuclear weapons exchange. And we, Gen Xers, were barely old enough to comprehend that fear and uncertainty that they lived through was finally coming to an end. The events of the late 80s and early 90s wasn't abstract to many of us, even as children. History wasn't just ink on a paper. To some of us, it was personal, real, and lived. My dad was one of those men who read the newspaper from front to back every day. And on Saturdays and Sundays, from late grade school all the way through about halfway through my high school years, I was up at 9 a.m. to go buy him a paper from the convenience store down the road before they ran out of papers. I had to do this because we had a couple neighbors who stole our delivered weekend paper frequently enough. And yes, he tried baiting those papers with dog crap or whatever else he could come up with more than once. The dad would often tell us, if you have questions about what's going on in the world, read the newspaper, pick up a book, watch the news. One of the biggest things that kind of stuck with me was he he often said if you could read and comprehend what you're reading, you could do almost anything. This was coming from a self-educated man with a GED that by the time I graduated high school, he was working as an engineer for one of the largest international telecom companies. No college degree. Everything he learned how to do was by reading books and getting his hands on the equipment. Nearly 20 years worth of hands-on experience before he became an engineer. When I asked about current events, he told me to read history, and he didn't always tell me what to think. We'd stay up most of the night on weekends with the intent of playing video game, only to have paused about halfway through the game and have a lecture or conversation that would go on for hours into the night and early morning. I don't think my dad ever realized how much those discussions shaped me or drove my interest and passion for history and the desire later to become a teacher. My mom helped feed that curiosity as well. She was an avid reader, and we went to the library as young kids, what seemed like every other week, especially during the summer. I read as much fiction as I did nonfiction and a lot of biographies. I wasn't just interested in historical events, but the men and women in them and what they were seeing and experiencing. Once we got a little older and our family was doing better financially, one of the things my mom wouldn't hesitate to do is buy us a book whenever we asked. I also had some incredible teachers, grade school through high school. Teachers who didn't just lecture, but they brought history to life. They connected past events and present consequences. They didn't make it dusty. They often made it seem urgent. I was also highly involved in Lincoln Douglas debate in high school. What's interesting about Lincoln Douglas debate and competition, you have to be able to argue for and against that issue or topic equally as well on either side, because you usually only find out what side you're arguing from right before you go into a round. And during the 90s, we had some really controversial topics as subjects to debate and competitions. And most everyone naturally would have a strong opinions favoring one side more than the other. LD debate really helped me to examine history, politics, and social issues from multiple perspectives. By my junior year of high school, I was convinced of something. I was going to be a high school history teacher, football coach, and, despite my dad's objections. In my mind, what better calling was there? Teach history, coach ball, two of the things I was most passionate about, help shape young minds and character. That was a dream. Well, it took about 14 years to get there. 6 year enlistment in the Navy, 4.5 years getting my bachelor's science in history, and a couple of jobs after graduate before I finally got the chance. Then finally, the classroom, the field. I loved it. I struggled with it. I had a love-hate relationship with the profession like many teachers do. I didn't want to be the stereotypical coach teacher that some of us might have had. You know, the one that rolls in the TV, shows a documentary, tells you to pull out your textbook and read sections 1 or 2, answer the questions at the back of the chapter, counts down till practice. I want to be great at both. It made for some really long days during the week, working nearly every weekend as that season was going on. And I had a young family at home at the time I wasn't seeing or spending much time with. After a few years, I realized something that hit me hard. I was spending more time mentoring and raising other people's sons than I was my own, and it didn't sit right. So I stepped away. I looked for other ways to serve. But the classroom never left me, nor my desire to teach. Now, what I'm going to say might make some people uncomfortable. This is not an attack on teachers whatsoever. This is my honest assessment on how history is taught in America's K through 12 classroom today. And it's largely because of state testing and guidelines that allow for very little flexibility or deviation, or else teacher risks not teaching everything or giving enough attention to something that their students are going to get tested over. First, history and civics are often taught and mandated by the state and federal government to, in a way, softly inspire nationalism and pride. And that's not inherently bad. Healthy love of country is not a sin, and most any country that teaches their history does so for that reason. But often, that's where the government's interest in students learning history stops, which leads me to my second point. Critical thinking is encouraged, but usually only about the past. Students are taught to critique Jefferson, critique Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, but question a recent present day government action or power policy. That's rarely encouraged in the same way. Third, history is often taught as a story of heroes and villains, presidents, generals, kings and queens, famous names etched into textbooks. But too often we forget that ordinary men and women, are behind them, the ones who fought the battles, marched in the streets, supported or resisted, and whose blood, sweat, and tears gave rise to the movements that truly moved history forward. When history is taught this way, it could leave the average student with the impression that they're insignificant, that to change the world or the course of events, one must rise to a high office or achieve great wealth or status. What is often forgotten is the origin story of many of those same heroes and villains that we study. Most of them are men and women, and most of the men and women who shape history did not begin with power or wealth. They often began in obscurity. Ordinary people whose convictions, courage, and choices eventually place them at the center of great events. And even then, many of these figures are often presented as near mythical, larger than life, carved in marble and memory. When in truth, they are flesh and bone just like the rest of us. They are equally capable of good and evil. They wrestle with doubt, emotion, ambition, and the heavy burden of events and issues and struggles of the time and the toll it took upon their human soul. History, in truth, is not the story of great figures. It is the story of ordinary people, flawed, human, often unknown, whose choices, sacrifices, and convictions moved the world forward. Fourth, we teach some of our national sins, but often in very narrow lanes. The Trail of Tears, the treatment of Native Americans, slavery, Civil War, Jim Crow, Civil Rights Movement, Japanese internment during World War II. And those matter deeply, but we rarely examine the more recent national decisions with the same moral seriousness, or study legislative, judicial, and executive decisions of the time made with the best of intentions that often have unintended consequences years later. And finally, high school teachers fight the constant uphill battle. Why does this matter? Why do we need to know this? History teacher likely asked to explain at least once during the school year why a movement or event that happened 50 or 100 years ago matters now. Why are we studying this? And the answer is, for most 16-year-olds, it doesn't matter yet. Relevance usually doesn't arrive until later. It arrives in your late 20s and early 30s. We've been working a while, paying taxes, raising kids, watching and voting in elections, feeling the effects of inflation or economic policy, serving in uniform, owning property, starting a business, watching the country change around you. That's when people start asking again, or asking for the first time. Why? Why is the system like this? Why are we in this war? Why is the debt this high? Why are we so divided? Why does this feel unstable? And that's where this podcast lives. So before we close this first episode, I want to take a moment to explain why this podcast exists. This program exists for the person who has started asking those questions again, or perhaps asking them for the first time. Not to preach party talking points, not to wave a partisan flag, not to defend one tribe while attacking another, but to cast light, to examine faith seriously, to examine history honestly, to examine politics without fear, and to remember something our culture seems to have forgotten. You can love your country and still hold it accountable. You can love your faith, but yet still wrestle with those hard questions. You can pursue truth without becoming cynical. You could disagree with your neighbor and still love them. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to dig and we're going to connect some dots. We're going to look at the primary resources and not just the headlines. We're going to ask the uncomfortable questions. And along the way, we might even discover that there are values and truths that we could all still agree on. But we're going to do it grounded in something bigger than politics. Because if faith does not shape how we think about history, something else will. Everybody reads history through a lens. The question isn't whether you have one. The question is what's shaping that lens. If faith does not shape how we interpret history, then something else will. Power, nationalism, ideology or party loyalty, economics, cultural trends, cynicism, or even raw emotion. Faith gives us moral categories. Without it, history becomes one or two extremes. Either a parade of national greatness or a guilt parade of national shame. Faith should prevent both. It reminds us, as human beings and the nations we build, we're capable of both greatness and failure. And just as faith would shape how we understand history, history should inform how we approach politics. Listen to the way a lot of political arguments or issues are framed today. It has never been this divided. It has never been this corrupt. It has never been this dangerous or fragile. But history humbles those claims. History reminds us that we have had bitter and contested elections before. We've had protests, riots, and unrest. We've seen presidents overreach, Congress abdicate its responsibilities, and courts disappoint the public before. We've seen plenty of corruption. We've survived deeply flawed leadership. History does not excuse these problems of the past or the present, but it puts them into proportion. We stop when we stop leading with wisdom and we start because if we stop examining politics through the lens of faith and history, something dangerous happens. We stop leading with wisdom and we start reacting with emotion. And when that happens, politics quickly devolves into outrage, tribalism, and reaction. And I'm not interested in reaction. I'm interested in understanding. Understanding that leads to wisdom and hopefully meaningful action that's guided by faith, truth, and humility. Because history is not just a story of presidents and generals, it's a story of ordinary people, citizens, believers, workers, parents, our servicemen and women. People will carry the weight of a generation shaped by the future through courage, conviction, and sacrifice. And if we study history with humility, we begin to understand something important. The challenges facing our nation today are not new, but the responsibility to face them wisely belongs to every generation, including ours. And the weeks ahead will explore the moments and decisions and ideas that shape this country, the good, the bad, the difficult, and the uncomfortable. And we'll do it through the lens of faith, history, and truth. Because if faith does not shape how we understand history, and if history does not guide how we approach politics, then we risk repeating the same mistakes again and again. But maybe, just maybe, the most important thing we could do as citizens today is start asking the right questions again. Thank you for your time, taking this time with me. Thank you for joining me on this first step of the journey. Till next time, I'm Jeremiah Ridge, and this has been the American Reckoning podcast, where faith leads, history speaks, and truth endures.